Chapter 32. You never saw who it was? Holt asked, as Gillen made his report. The young ranger shook his head. It may not have been a person at all. It could have been a small animal. But you don't think so? Holt asked. This time Gillen hesitated before he answered. No, I don't, he said finally. I would have gone closer to examine the ground, but I didn't know if he'd gone or was still in the area, or if he had friends with him. If some kind of ruckus had started, it would have given everything away to the Tuolagi. I thought it was better to come back here and report. Yes, you are right, Holt said, frowning over the news. He looked at Selathan. Any idea who might be keeping an eye on the Tuolagi? He asked. The Wakir shrugged. He'd been considering the question since Gillen had first reported. There could be a Bedouin party somewhere in the area. They come and go as they please. If so, it would make sense for them to keep an eye on the enemy. Would they be likely to attack them? Holt asked. This time, the Wakir was more definite in his answer. I wouldn't think so. They don't usually go looking for trouble, and a party of 200 Tuolagi is a lot to take on. I was thinking the same thing myself, Holt interposed. Selathan nodded gravely. Quite so, but if they were Bedouin watching, odds are they would simply move away and give the Tuolagi as wide a berth as possible. Do you think he saw you? Holt asked. Gillen shook his head. I'm sure he didn't. I only saw him because he moved suddenly. There was no need for Holt to ask Gillen if he'd moved. He knew his former student would never make such a fundamental mistake. You covered your tracks coming back, of course. Of course, Gillen replied. Don't worry, Holt. I left no sign that I'd been there. Holt came to a decision. All right, we can catch a few hours' sleep. We'll push on as usual when it gets a little closer to dawn. See if you can get some rest, people. Selathan and the Araluans turned and headed for their respective tents. They all knew the value of getting as much rest as this situation allowed. Unfortunately, while Gillen had left no tracks, the unknown observer had not been so careful or so skilled, and by the worst possible chance, the path he took when he left the Tuolagi campsite led within 1/4 kilometre of the camp where the Erak troops had spent the night. An hour after Selathan had led the party on their way, Tuolagi scouts, following the tracks discovered near their camp, chanced across those left by the mixed Araluan-Erak group. They followed them carefully until the Erak troops came in sight. Then, taking a wide curve to keep from being seen themselves, they hurried back to their own leaders to report that an armed party was travelling on a parallel course to their own. After a quick consultation, half of the Tuolagi split off and dropped back behind the others, then travelled southwest until they too cut across the trail of Selathan's troops. They picked up the pace at that point and began moving closer to the unsuspecting Erak. Holt and Gillen, expecting that if any trouble came it would be from the northeast, had no idea that 100 mounted warriors were closing in on them from the south. Nor were they aware that the lead party of Tuolagi had begun to move faster and to angle slowly across their path. The hunters had become the hunted. They stopped in the middle of the day, as was their custom. It was this fact that gave the Tuolagi leaders their final opportunity to spring the trap they had spent the day preparing. After the main heat of the day had passed, and before they continued on their way, the Araluans were discussing ideas for a possible rescue operation. Under cover of darkness, either of the two rangers would be able to make his way into the camp unseen by the Tuolagi. The problem arose when it came to getting Erak out unseen. That's why they keep him out in the open, of course, Evelyn said. If he escapes, anyone looking in that direction can see that he's gone. Plus, You'll need a way to cut him loose from those camels, Horace put in. Maybe only one, Svengel suggested. If you could cut the chains to one, he could ride the other one out of the camp. Be just a little obvious, Gillen said. The combination of a Scandian and a camel isn't exactly hard to notice, and the last thing we want is a running fight with 200 Tuolagi. Holt sat to one side, quietly listening as his friends put up suggestions, then rejected them. Most of these thoughts he'd already examined, but there was always the chance that a stray remark might trigger the eventual solution to their problem. Not so far, however, he thought ruefully. For the moment, the best they could hope to do was continue as they were. If they could reach the wells before the Tuolagi, they might be able to arrange something. Exactly what, he had no idea. But long experience had taught him that if you waited long enough, sooner or later, an unexpected opportunity might arise. You're quiet, Holt, Horace said, turning to where the grey-bearded ranger sat. Do you have any? His voice trailed away to silence as his eyes lifted from Holt to the ridge behind him, some 150 metres away. Good God, he said, in a more urgent tone of voice. Where did they come from? The others followed his gaze. They had camped in a large, saucer-shaped depression, concealed from the sight of any Tuolagi stragglers. But the problem with concealing yourself from sight is that others can be concealed as well. Selethan had pickets out, of course, beyond the ridgeline. But later they would see the bodies of those men lying where the Tuolagi skirmishers had killed them. For the moment, their attention was fixed upon the line of armed horsemen that had just materialized over the ridge, spreading out in a semicircle across their intended line of march. Holt swore softly and turned quickly to look behind them. As he had feared, another line of horsemen stood at the top of that ridge. They were trapped between the two parties, each of which was at least 100 strong. By now, others had seen the enemy as well, and the Aridi troops were running and shouting, pointing to the two lines of horsemen who had them trapped. Selethan's voice rose above the others, and the moment of panic passed as he began to form his men into a defensive circle, with their horses inside it. The 4 Araluans and Svengel quickly gathered their weapons and moved to join the Aridi leader. Selethan cursed bitterly. Only the night before he had boasted about the Tuolagi's overconfidence. Now he had fallen into the same trap. The desert raiders were wily and unpredictable. He should always have assumed that they might get wind of the fact that someone was trailing them. That they had done so through an immense stroke of luck was unknown to him. Even if he had known it, it wouldn't have changed things. A good leader should plan for bad luck. As Holt and the others joined him, he nodded briefly. There was no point in recriminations, he knew. Now all they could do was create the best defense they could. You're fighting them on foot? Holt asked. The Aridi nodded. No point in mounting and trying to charge them. We're too badly outnumbered. And you'd be charging uphill, Horace remarked. All the advantage would lie with them. Let them come to us. Selethan looked at him, a little surprised. For one so young, Horace had sized up the tactical situation quickly. Most of Selethan's young troopers would have chosen to charge the enemy, he knew. Horace saw the look, guessed at the thought behind it, and shrugged. He'd had good teachers. He unsheathed his sword now, the blade hissing out of the scabbard. Svengel was looking around the ring of Aridi warriors. They had their shields locked together, and each man was armed with one of the slender lances they usually used from horseback. In addition, each one wore a curved sabre for close quarters work. Shield wall, he said approvingly. Good work. It was a standard Scandian battle tactic, and he felt instantly at home. He swung his massive battle axe experimentally, the huge, heavy blade making a thick swooshing sound as it passed through the air. For now, he'd stand back, but the minute a gap appeared in the wall, he'd fill it. Any Tuolagi warrior planning on breaking through would have an ugly surprise waiting for him. Horace looked at him and read his thoughts. "I'll join you," he said quietly, moving to stand shoulder to shoulder with the bear-like northerner. Svengel grinned at him. "With us two, we could probably send the rest of these boys home," he said. Gillen and Holt also stood side by side, but in the centre of the ring formed by the shield wall. Evelyn looked at them, her heart thudding nervously in her chest. They all seemed so calm. She was sure her hands were trembling. For a moment, she thought of getting her sling from where it was concealed, but she realized that the two rangers' longbows would provide more than adequate long-distance firepower. Instead, she accepted a spare shield from Selethan and eased her sabre in and out of its scabbard. No need to draw it yet, she thought. She swallowed nervously. Holt saw her and called softly, "Evelyn, come here with us." As she moved to stand beside the rangers, he gestured to the ridge at their back. "Gillen and I are going to concentrate our fire to the front. Keep an eye on the Tuolagi behind us. When they're within 50 meters, let us know and we'll switch." "Yes, Holt," she said. Her mouth was dry and she didn't trust herself to say more. Gillen grinned at her. "Make sure we hear you," he said. "There'll be plenty of yelling going on." He was so relaxed and unworried, she thought. His casual manner helped to ease the butterflies that were swarming in her stomach. Selethan approached them now. "They'll try the easy way first," he said, "an all-out charge to see if they can break our position." "Might not turn out to be as easy as they think," Gillen replied, testing the draw on his bow. Selethan regarded him for a moment. Soon, he thought, he would see just how well these two cloaked foreigners could shoot. He had the feeling that he wasn't going to be disappointed. "Can I suggest you put 4 men with Svengel and Horace?" Holt said. "Use them as a reserve for any place the line is broken." "Good idea," Selethan replied. They might be outnumbered 4-1, but he suspected the Tuolagi were about to get a bloody nose. He called 4 names, and the men he had selected dropped out of the shield wall and hurried back to where he stood. The others closed up the gaps where they had been as Svengel gave the 4 their orders. "Just tell them to give me a little elbow room," Svengel said. He was grinning, Evelyn noticed. Finally, after the heat and the sand and the sore riding muscles, Svengel was about to do something he really enjoyed. She found herself smiling at the thought. Holt noticed her lips twitching slightly. Good girl, he thought. They heard the jingle of harness before any movement was perceptible. Then the 2 lines of horsemen began to move forward. "Here they come," Horace said quietly.